Imagine a world before memory. A world where the sky was closer, where the mountains had not yet learned silence, and where the earth trembled not from earthquakes but from footsteps. Enormous footsteps. The kind that shook rivers from their courses and sent entire herds of animals fleeing in blind terror across ancient plains. This was not a world that history remembers clearly. It was a world swallowed by water, erased by divine judgment, buried beneath layers of sediment and silence. But fragments survived. Ancient texts. Whispered traditions passed from generation to generation in the shadows of forgotten civilizations. And among those fragments, one of the most disturbing questions has endured across millennia: what did they eat? What fed the giants of the antediluvian world? What sustained creatures of such colossal size that ancient traditions describe them as consuming the labor of entire nations in a single meal? The Book of Enoch, one of the most mysterious and debated texts of the ancient world, offers answers that are as terrifying as they are fascinating. And those answers did not simply describe a diet. They described a catastrophe. A slow, grinding, consuming catastrophe that devoured the world from the inside out, long before the first drop of the Great Flood ever touched the earth. To understand the diet of the Nephilim, one must first understand what they were. According to the traditions preserved in the Book of Enoch, the Nephilim were the offspring of the Watchers, a group of angels who descended to earth and took human women as companions. The Watchers, described in Enochian tradition as 200 in number, landed on a mountain called Hermon, a name derived from an ancient root meaning oath or curse, as if the very geography of the earth recorded their transgression. From the union of these fallen beings and mortal women came children of impossible size and impossible hunger. The text describes them as giants who consumed all the acquisitions of men. That single phrase carries within it the weight of an entire civilization collapsing. All the acquisitions of men. Everything humanity had cultivated, harvested, built, and stored. Picture the antediluvian world as ancient traditions describe it. A land of extraordinary fertility. The earth before the flood is often portrayed in ancient sources as vastly different from the world we know today. Some ancient traditions suggest a canopy of water above the atmosphere that created a greenhouse effect across the entire planet, producing lush vegetation of enormous scale, forests where the trees dwarfed anything alive today, plains covered in grain and fruit of exceptional abundance. This was a world capable of feeding populations and creatures of tremendous size. And yet even this extraordinarily fertile world was not enough. The Book of Enoch describes the progression of the Nephilim's consumption in a sequence that reads almost like a chronicle of ecological collapse. They began, as all creatures begin, with what was available. The grains of the fields. The fruits of the orchards. The livestock of the plains. But the appetites of the Nephilim were not calibrated to a world of natural balance. They were calibrated to something else entirely. Something that had no precedent in the natural order because the Nephilim themselves had no precedent in the natural order. They were hybrids. Children of the boundary between the divine and the mortal. And like all things that cross boundaries that were never meant to be crossed, they carried within them a fundamental imbalance. Ancient traditions preserved across multiple cultures describe these beings as standing at heights that defy modern imagination. Some traditions place them at sizes large to carry entire trees as walking staffs. Others describe them wading through rivers that would have submerged ordinary humans entirely. The Book of Giants, a text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and connected to the Enochian tradition, speaks of these beings in language that pulses with their overwhelming physical presence. They were not simply large. They were a different order of existence entirely. And their hunger was proportional to that difference. When the Nephilim had consumed everything that human agriculture could provide, the ancient texts describe a turning point that marks one of the darkest passages in antediluvian history. The grain ran out. The orchards were stripped bare. The livestock disappeared from the plains. What came next was described in the Book of Enoch with a directness that still carries its horror across thousands of years of distance. The giants turned to humanity itself. The ancient text states that they sinned against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, consuming their flesh and drinking their blood. And then, in language that reads like the tolling of a great bell, it states that they began to devour one another. To understand what this means in its full context, one must understand the ancient view of blood as the seat of life itself. This was not merely a dietary transgression in the understanding of the ancient world. It was a metaphysical violation. The consumption of blood represented the consumption of the divine life force embedded in living creatures. It represented an attempt to absorb the vitality of the world itself, to feed a hunger so profound that ordinary sustenance could no longer address it. The Watchers had shared forbidden knowledge with humanity. They had taught humans sorcery and enchantments and the cutting of roots. They had taught women the art of beautification and men the art of weaponry. But among all the knowledge they shared, the knowledge of blood, of its power and its forbidden nature, was perhaps the most dangerous inheritance they left behind. Now step back from the individual narrative and consider what this description meant at a civilizational scale. The antediluvian world, according to these ancient traditions, was not a primitive world. It was a world of considerable sophistication. The Watchers themselves had introduced advanced knowledge to humanity. Metalworking, agriculture, astronomy, the reading of signs in the earth and sky. Ancient traditions described cities of considerable scale, structures built with stones of enormous size that ancient human technology should not have been able to move. And yet those cities existed. And those cities fed the Nephilim. And when the cities could no longer feed them, those cities themselves became part of what was consumed. The Mesopotamian traditions that parallel the Book of Enoch speak of a time before the flood when kings ruled for thousands of years and civilizations rose to heights of knowledge and power that the post-flood world would take millennia to recover. The Sumerian king list records antediluvian rulers whose reigns stretch across tens of thousands of years, numbers that seem impossible to modern minds but that ancient scribes recorded with the same matter-of-fact precision they applied to everything else. What sustained such extraordinary lifespans? What fed a world where kings ruled for 800 years and where the boundaries between human and divine were far more permeable than anything we experience today? Some ancient interpretations suggest that the antediluvian diet itself was radically different from anything that came after. That the food of the pre-flood world contained properties that post-flood food no longer possesses. That the earth itself, before the catastrophic geological transformation of the flood, produced substances of extraordinary nutritional density. Fruits and grains that carried within them a life-sustaining power that has been completely lost. The ancient Hebrew concept of the world before the flood suggests a fundamentally different relationship between living creatures and the energy that sustained them, a relationship that the flood permanently and irreversibly altered. But the Nephilim were not simply consuming the food of the antediluvian world. They were consuming its essence. Consider the symbolic weight of what the ancient texts describe. A creature of hybrid origin, neither fully divine nor fully human, feeding first on the products of human labor, then on the animals of creation, then on human beings themselves, and finally on each other. This is not simply a description of dietary excess. This is a description of a system consuming itself. A world where the very beings who were supposed to be evidence of the connection between heaven and earth had instead become the agents of that world's destruction, devouring it layer by layer until nothing remained but the necessity of divine intervention. The Book of Enoch does not describe the flood as arbitrary punishment. It describes it as response. The cries of the earth itself, personified in ancient tradition as a living entity capable of witness and testimony, rose to heaven carrying the record of what the Nephilim had done. The earth cried out against the lawless ones. Against those who had consumed without measure, who had taken without regard for the balance that sustains all living systems. The ancient text presents the flood not as destruction but as cleansing, a washing away of a contamination so thorough and so deep that only total renewal could address it. There is something in this ancient narrative that speaks to questions far older than any specific religious tradition. The question of what happens when appetite exceeds natural limits. What happens when beings of extraordinary power lose the capacity for restraint? What happens when consumption becomes the only relationship a creature can have with the world around it? These are questions that ancient storytellers embedded in the narrative of the Nephilim with a precision that suggests they were not simply telling a story about giants. They were telling a story about the nature of excess itself. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, fragments of the Book of Giants offer glimpses of the Nephilim that the canonical Book of Enoch only hints at. These fragments, discovered in the caves of Qumran and painstakingly reconstructed by scholars, describe the giant children of the Watchers engaging in violence and consumption on a scale that troubled even the Watchers themselves. In one remarkable fragment, the Watchers are described as watching what their children had become with something approaching horror. They had descended to earth for reasons the ancient texts describe with various degrees of sympathy and condemnation. But they had not anticipated what their offspring would do to the world they had chosen over heaven. The hybrid creatures that ancient traditions associate with the antediluvian world, the beings described in various mythological systems as products of the boundary between species and between realms, all carry within them a version of this same characteristic: unnatural hunger. Consumption that exceeds natural limits. The Mesopotamian creature Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, was described as a being whose very breath was destruction. The creatures that Gilgamesh encountered on the edges of the known world were beings that consumed without restraint, that represented the appetite of the wild pushed beyond any natural boundary. In Egyptian traditions, the chaos creature Apep was described as a being of infinite hunger, attempting to swallow the sun itself each night in a consumption so vast it threatened the entire cosmic order. These mythological parallels are not coincidences. They are echoes. Fragments of a shared ancient memory about a time when the world experienced something of extraordinary consequence, when the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were dissolved by an act of transgression, and when the consequences of that dissolution were written across the face of the earth in a language of consumption and devastation that every subsequent civilization felt compelled to record. The ancient Greek traditions preserved in Hesiod speak of a race of heroes who lived before the current age, beings of extraordinary power who are now described as dwelling in the islands of the blessed at the edges of the world. But before those traditions were softened by time and retelling, earlier versions spoke of beings far more troubling. Giants who waged war against the gods themselves. The Gigantomachy, the war between the giants and the Olympians, is presented in Greek tradition as one of the defining conflicts of cosmic history, a struggle so intense that it required the combined power of gods and demigods to resolve. And at the heart of that struggle was the same essential question that the Book of Enoch raises: what happens when beings of extraordinary power have appetites that the world cannot satisfy? Return now to the specific question this narrative began with. The diet of the Nephilim 4,500 years before the flood. The ancient texts, taken together, describe not a single diet but a progression. A descent through stages of consumption that mirrors the moral and spiritual descent described throughout the Book of Enoch. They began with grain and fruit, the products of the earth tended by human hands. They moved to livestock, consuming the animals that sustained human civilization. They moved to wild creatures, birds and beasts and the fish of the sea, consuming the natural world itself. And finally, in the passage that carries the most weight in the Enochian tradition, they turned to human flesh and to each other. This progression is not presented in the ancient texts as simple violence or simple evil. It is presented as inevitability. As the logical conclusion of what happens when beings of unnatural origin exist within a natural world without the constraints that would have kept them in balance. The Nephilim were not evil by simple choice in the way that the ancient traditions frame it. They were imbalanced by nature. They were the product of a transgression that built imbalance into their very constitution. And that imbalance expressed itself, as imbalance always does, through appetite. What the Book of Enoch preserves in its description of the antediluvian diet is something that scholars of ancient literature have increasingly recognized as one of the most sophisticated ecological narratives in all of ancient writing. Before the modern concept of ecological collapse was articulated in scientific terms, the ancient authors of the Enochian tradition described its essential mechanism with startling accuracy. A dominant species with no natural predators and unlimited appetite consuming through every available resource tier until the system itself fails. The grain disappears. The livestock disappears. The wild animals disappear. The humans disappear. And in the final stage, the dominant species itself begins to disappear, turning inward in a consumption that is the final expression of a system that has destroyed its own foundations. The flood, in this reading of the ancient texts, was not an act of anger. It was an act of ecological reset. The ancient earth, pushed to the absolute limit of what consumption could do to a living world, received the intervention that restored its capacity to sustain life. And in the waters of that intervention, the Nephilim and their hunger were extinguished. The world that emerged on the other side of the flood was a different world. Shorter lived. Less fertile. More fragile. But capable of beginning again. And perhaps that is the deepest question that the antediluvian traditions leave us with. Not simply what the giants ate, but what they represent. Because the story of the Nephilim and their insatiable hunger is, at its most fundamental level, a story about what happens when the boundary between the limitless and the limited is erased. When beings of divine origin enter the finite world and bring with them an appetite calibrated to infinity. The world of limits cannot sustain an appetite without limits. Something must give. Something always gives. The ancient authors knew this. They wrote it into the oldest layers of human storytelling. And in the fragments that survive, in the ancient texts that scholars still work to translate and interpret, that warning still echoes. 4,500 years before the flood, the giants walked. They ate. They consumed. And the earth, that patient witness, remembered everything. It remembered so thoroughly that even now, thousands of years after the waters receded and the world began again, we still find ourselves drawn to these stories. Still asking the questions that the ancient texts embedded in their descriptions of impossible beings and impossible appetites. Still wondering, in the quiet between one age and the next, what we have learned from the hunger of the Nephilim. And whether we have learned it well enough.